to the Peak District. It's historic and beautiful, Ashbourne, but it's beautiful not just because of its fabulous setting, but because of a veritable cornucopia of Georgian architecture. It would be lovely to have you all there with us today, but as there's well over 100 of us, it might be a little crowded. But in these circumstances, we can't get together for another month or two. So this time it's going to be a virtual tour, so there's room for all of us. We have today not one, but two of our trustees to guide you around Ashbourne. So a double plus there, win-win. And first of all, I want to introduce Barry Joyce, who was for many decades the Design and Conservation Officer for Derbyshire, looking after the whole of Derbyshire. And we've got a lot to thank him for. Now he's retired, retired from that job, but actually working very hard voluntarily for the Trust. And Mark Summerfield, who's a researcher and surveyor, and he is still working, but luckily he has a bit of spare time. And so he's putting a lot of voluntary time into the Trust. And he lives at Brailsford, not far from Ashbourne, and is very familiar with the town. So I'm going to hand them over, hand you over to them, and to say to Barry, if you want to kick off, Barry, and I hope everyone enjoys the tour.
Good afternoon. Very nice to have you with us. Well, I'm Barry Joyce, and also on my screen is fellow presenter Mark Summerfield. Our story this afternoon relates to the town's development between 1700 and 1830, what we've billed as the Georgian period. But underneath all those elegant Georgian facades are, in some cases, older buildings, and underneath that lies the medieval town plan. Now, this is an extract from a wonderful map of 1547, the copy of which has been kindly made available to us by the Ashbourne Heritage Society. It shows a classic medieval arrangement from west to east, or in this case, bottom to top. You have the church, the connecting street, the marketplace, and right at the top, far east, the hall. If you could just go back, Mark, you'll note the two market crosses and also very early encroachment of development into a once larger marketplace. Our presentation will focus on the street, Church Street, and also St. John Street. The charming pictorial nature of the map shows houses hard onto the street, their pitched roofs being either at right angles to or front onto it. Now, if you would note the churchyard lich gate, we will come back to that later. Can you see it there? We now move on to a wonderful, equally wonderful map of 1830, which shows Georgian Ashbourne pretty well complete. Essentially an unchanged layout. The property divisions still relating to medieval burgage plots. Once large yards for storage of farm produce, craft workshops, runs for hens and pigs and other stock, and are now, in this map, polite gardens. But there's one notable plan change, which is the road extending east past the hall, which originally divorced the hall from its park. You'll see this has now been extinguished. The hall had been the seat of the Cockayne family, but in the 18th century it had become the home of the Boothby family. A major a major character in our story. In 1784, Brooke Boothby, who on the death of his father became the 6th Baronet and was a friend of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but more of that later, he leased the hall from his father in 1784 and remodeled the park in the style made popular by Capability Brown. Another major character in George and Ashbourne was Dr. Taylor, clergyman, Justice of the Peace, Deputy Lord Lieutenant and chaplain to the Duke of Devonshire, and childhood friend of the great Dr. Johnson. He lived at the west end of the street in the mansion. Now you'll see on this map a serpentine lake. This identifies the location of Dr. Taylor's property. The garden is an amalgamation of a number of burgage plots. Terraced lawns led down to the lake. It's actually a large pond shaped to look larger. And beyond stretches what from the house would appear to be an extensive country house park. In fact, it's a paddock, as it says on the map, ingeniously bounded by densely planted trees, which hide its urban context. It's a masterpiece of deception. There's a lovely anecdote, and I like to think it's true, but actually you cannot see a coach drive in the ground, so you may have to take it with a pinch of salt. But Dr. Taylor's greatest social ambition was to have the Duke of Devonshire to dine at the mansion. And when he achieved this, it's said that he bribed the coachman to make sure the blinds were down and to drive several times around the house drive before he actually stopped at the house. We now move from plan form to Church Street itself, at the west end of which is the town's ancient church, dedicated to the Northumbrian king and saint Oswald. But we're not today concerned with the church, but to the early 18th century gateway to the church yard. Now, I hope you remember the Lich Gate on the 1547 map. That has been replaced by this magnificent gateway. The handsome wrought iron gates are by the great Derbyshire blacksmith, Robert Bakewell. The gates are hung from quite remarkable stone piers. They are a memento mori, a reminder that we must all die. They're 17th century in character rather than 18th century and speak of more archaic times than Georgian urbanity. Nevertheless, they start our tour of George and Ashbourne and merit a closer look. This engraving by Martin van Heemskerk from his Wonders of the World series shows early fascination with all things Egyptian. And this fascination is clearly the origin of those extraordinary pyramidal finials. They stand on skulls at each corner. They're topped by flaming grenades, an ancient military symbol. The entrance to Bess of Hardwick's withdrawing chamber at Hardwick Hall is surmounted by a soldier's head topped with a flaming grenade, a vivid warning. Ruskin hated these gates and suggested they should be broken up and used to repair the roads. We now turn round from looking at the gates to the view from them down Church Street. Described by Sir Nicholas Pesner as one of the finest streets in Derbyshire, it has a large variety of excellent houses and whole stretches without anything that could jar. I hand you over to Mark now to walk you down it, and it will be chronological in order.
Thank you, Barry. That was a really good introduction. Before we whisk you to the other end of town, so we want to try and walk back up Church Street from the east to the west, as opposed from the west to the east. I thought I'd just point out this building on the left-hand side. For those of you who've never been to Ashbourne or only driven through Ashbourne, this is the very old Elizabethan grammar school that I think was built in around sort of 1580. And we won't be talking about the grammar school today, and it seems such a shame not to mention it, really, because we're focusing on the Georgian period. This grammar school isn't part of our presentation, so I thought I'd just point it out.
What we could mention is the paving in front of it, which are a characteristic of Georgian towns was the fact that they were paved. Before that, the paving was generally just consolidated earth. So a handsome town had to have good paving, and Ashbourne was paved quite early on. And we do have a record of the paving having been extensively repaired in Ashbourne between 1727 and 1732, when ale was given to the workmen for gathering stones for cobbles from the bed of the River Dove. So you got extra ale for working in the cold river.
Thank you, Barry. I'm going to whisk you right to the other end of town, which is essentially the bottom of the marketplace. For those of you who have been to Ashbourne, you'll probably know this building quite well. It's quite a famous building in Ashbourne. It's called the Gingerbread Shop, and it's now a bakery run by a local company, Birds. But the reason I'm showing it you is to try and imagine what Ashbourne would have looked like in the late 17th century. In the late 17th century, most of the buildings would have been very similar to this building. So mainly two stories with timber frame structures, and rather than having tiled roofs as this building now has, it would have had a thatched roof. And what you see at this point in the late 17th century is a change from the regional vernacular to something more imported from the continent. And as Barry said, you see a sort of change in the period of urbanization in Ashbourne that sort of developed over roughly about 100 years, and it started around now. And I think the driving forces of those things were the obvious ones. So an increase in trade, an increase in wealth, and an increase in aspiration. But there's some material facts that belie that, which is that just as in London in 1666, there was a Great Fire here in Ashbourne in 1672, so only 4 years after the Great Fire of London, and then again in 1697. So buildings were either lost or partially lost in this time. So building plots were starting to emerge as opportunities for rebuilding to take place. And because of the sort of regular fires, building materials started to change and started to resemble things that were slightly more fireproof. So in terms of timber and straw and reed, the replacement was going to be brick and tile. And then the style started to change, or the structure started to change, which from timber frame to more load-bearing wall structures. So a sort of slight shift in how the structure worked of buildings. And then a stylistic change from the regional vernacular that you see in front of you to, as Barry said, a sort of more urbane and imported style that came over from the continent. And I think this slide epitomizes that period of transition. So this is a late Queen Anne terrace. The building on your left is number 53 and number 55, and the building on your right is number 51. And you can see the contrast between these two buildings. So one building has remained pretty much in its sort of Queen Anne terrace state, and the one next door has gone through roughly about 150 years of remodels and upgrades. And that building is 51 Church Street, what we now call Chantry House. And if you look at the building, you can see that those changes are sort of all over the building. If you take from the top, you can see the introduction of a parapet wall. You can see fretwork, 19th century fretwork on the dormers. You can see a dentelated cornice just below the parapet. You can see a Georgian door case. You can see 19th century sash windows, and you can see the application of what we now refer to as stucco. This is actually cement render, I think now, but nevertheless, it would have been stucco at its time. So you can see that these types of buildings, even these smaller Georgian terraces, were being sort of upgraded quite regularly. And then roughly about 1700, you get a building plot in number 24, number 26 Church Street. Again, a sort of really good characteristic example of what Georgian architecture started to look like in the early 18th century. So if you can imagine this building without its inserted shop front, you can see that you've got 4 bays over 3 stories, classically proportioned with good symmetry and a central door case. Now, and as you can see in the projecting central bay, you can see sort of highly decorated pilasters. And this is what I tend to refer to as dressing up box Georgian because of its highly decorated mode. And these pilasters are if you've ever stood by these pilasters, you'll realize that they're not on a human scale at all. If you even look at the width of them compared to the door case, you can see that they're very wide and very tall. And here's some of the architectural details from there. So very, very normal stepped Queen Anne coins. And then on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, you can see the ionic form of the pilaster and the roundel at the top, giving more of the detail of that particular building. And then if we move just next door, actually, so, and probably only by about 10 years, I would have said, but you can see a significant change already in the style of architecture. So we're still probably late Queen Anne here, even though George I has now taken the throne. We still refer to this building as Queen Anne. Its style is Queen Anne. But it's got a flatter front. You've got 7 bays over 3 stories with a panelled parapet wall. So very different to its neighbour. You can see that the paneling, the parapet doesn't carry on, and the house protrudes or projects from its next door neighbour. Now, obviously, this house historically wouldn't have had 2 shop fronts inserted into it. They were inserted in the sort of late 20s, early 30s. But it would have been a very grand house. It was occupied by John Beresford in the sort of late 1730s. But we think, and I think this is based on some really good work produced by the Ashbourne Local History Group under the guidance of Andrew Hemstock, who I think is on the presentation today, tells us that this may have actually been built for John Fitzherbert originally, and then John Beresford took rent of it much later. Just a detail, this is a detail that's retained from that period. So a lovely Queen Anne shell hood or porch hood. Is in reasonably good condition, but you can see it could probably do with a lick of paint. And then moving literally directly across the road, which is Vine House, currently occupied by Bagshaws, the estate agents. Now this house presents a little bit of an anomaly in the sense that, as Barry said, in the early 1950s, Nicholas Pevsner came to town and really liked Church Street. He wrote some lovely things about Church Street in the first edition of Buildings of England. But as he was walking past this building, he decided that it was late 18th century. Now, it's possible that it could be late 18th century, but I often look at this building and think about it being slightly earlier. And I think going back to the Ashbourne Local History Group, they've indicated that this building was probably occupied by John Alsop in the 1730s and 1740s. So it puts it slightly earlier than Pevsner. Now, unfortunately, that date that Pevsner gave has sort of found its way into the statutory designation. So it's Grade 2 listed, this building, but its designation still reports that it's late 18th century. But if you look at its slightly restless brickwork as opposed to its fenestration, I think you probably have to concur it's probably a little bit earlier than late 18th century. A lovely Roman Doric portico. It's a great building. It's certainly a very grand facade. I often joke that I think if it were late 18th century, no 18th century gent would want a sort of rainwater pipe running down the front of such a grand house. So that might tell you its actual date. Just below it, actually, we've noticed that there's actually part of what could have been a much older building, a mullioned window that exists at the basement level of this building. So it's clear that the facade, as I said with the early buildings, was built on top of this original or extant building. And speaking about windows, perhaps the most obvious characteristic of any Georgian building is the ubiquitous sash window. I've put 2 sash windows here that are roughly separated by about 100 years. So the one on the left is from number 9 and number 11 Church Street, and the one on the right is from number 13, which was up until very recently the Ashbourne Heritage Centre. But the differences are perhaps obvious, which is that the glazing bars on the left-hand side are much thicker than, or much heavier, if you like, than the glazing bars on the right-hand side. And if you look at the window case itself, you can see that the window case on the left-hand side is flush with the brickwork, whereas the window case on the right-hand side is actually recessed into the window. And this is a consequence of something we experience in our daily lives now, which is the introduction of building regulations in the 18th century. So we had a 1709 Building Act and a 1774 Building Act. And both of those acts tried to think about the spread of fire on facades of buildings. So the reason for recessing the window by about 4 inches was to try and create a sort of little mini break or a little mini fire break if possible. So this tells you that this window is much earlier by the thickness of its glazing bars and its casement being flush. And this other window, which is probably from about 1820, 1830, sorry, 1920, 1930, would have been recessed by about 4 inches. If you look at the picture on the left-hand side as well, you also see something that's characteristic of not necessarily just Derbyshire, but generally the East Midlands, which is Flemish bond brickwork that with burnt headers. So you can see that the bricks are sort of slightly colourful, if you like, with burnt headers, so darker bricks. A consequence, I think, of probably builders or brickmakers in the area who would probably have been working on places like Sudbury Hall, which is Sudbury Hall, you get quite an extensive use of burnt headers in their diaphragm patterns. And then just moving down the streets just slightly, we've got number 7 Church Street, which is Oswald House. 3 bays or 4 bays, if you will, and 3 stories with a projecting service wing on the right-hand side and a very nice stucco door case. Again, I would say roughly early to mid Georgian. You can see the window casements are flush with the brickwork, so it tells us that it's quite early. Key blocks on the window heads, a very good and well presented building that would have been a very high status at the time. Now, interestingly, I'm sure some of you will know that this is actually the local dentist now. And recently, Barry managed to charm his way into the back garden to have a look at something that he knew was of interest to us.
Thank you. Yeah. In the 1970s, I helped administer a conservation area grant scheme for Ashbourne. And this gave me the entree to parts of the town which members of the public can't normally see. And that was one of the great perks of the job. One of the nicest discoveries were the wonderful gardens behind the houses in Church Street. Behind handsome Oswald's house lies this equally handsome garden. High brick walls define what was once the medieval burgage plot that the garden occupies. And you'll see steps lead up the terraced lawns along an axis at the top of which stands this delightful arbour. Now the arbour's possibly, or even probably, contemporary with the 1740 house. It's an apsidal shelter bounded by banded stone pilasters. A moulded cornice surmounts it, and the semicircular arched head to the shelter has a projecting keystone. The arbour faces due south, the perfect aspect and location for a garden arbour. And at this elevated level gives terrific views out over the old Derby Road and the Derby Hill beyond. This side view shows how the tiled back to the hemispherical head of the alcove protects it from the weather. And there is another similar but rather later arbour which graces the garden of the Ivies of 49 Church Street. But sadly, in the 20th century, this was given over to housing a filtration plant for a swimming pool. And so it has lost some of its elegance as a result.
Thank you, Barry. Just moving slightly westward up the street now, we've got Holland House, which is, again, I would probably say there's a little bit of leeway on the date here. We think it's probably either in between 1740 and 1760. It's a 4-bay house, but you'll clearly see that the 4th bay, so the extension, was added slightly later. We think about sort of 1790, 1800. And you can see the difference actually from, if you look at the windows on the extension, you can see that the windows are slightly more recessed than they are on the main house. But the main house is actually quite a grand, again, high status house with 3 bays, 3 stories with a parapet, a moulded cornice, rusticated window heads, and a segmented or curved pediment above the door. This house eventually occupied one of the justice of the peace, so it was a very high status house. And interestingly, if you it's probably not that obvious from the slide looking at it now, but you can see that topography of the road changes quite dramatically from where the carriageway is to where the pathway seems to cut through the bottom of the sash windows at the ground level. And that was because just to the left of here, there was a railway bridge. With the coming of the railways, a railway bridge was inserted into the road, and the road had to be raised to accommodate the railway bridge and the coming trains. So unfortunately, the house took a sort of a slope from it from that point onwards. And then we move to what is historically known as, or the first of, the Pickford Villas. And we have the first one here, which is called the Grey House, and we'll talk about the second one, which is just across the street. But these were three houses that were built in Ashbourne, roughly about within 10 years of 1760. And they're called the Pickford Villas because we believe, or there's a consensus now that's developed, that these were actually either designed and built by the Derby architect, Joseph Pickford. This first one, the Grey House, was built in around 1763. And I guess if we think about Pickford's relationship with the owner, we can start to sort of build a pattern of what is circumstantial evidence, but that circumstantial evidence is growing quite substantially. So Pickford had a business relationship with the owner of this house, a gentleman called Brian Hodgson. He was an innkeeper who kept inns at both Buxton and Stamford, and had done very well as a tradesman. He wasn't a gentleman, he was a tradesman, so equal in some sense to Joseph Pickford himself. And this house, we think, was a remodel of a house that was probably not that old. And you can see from the central composition, the sort of Palladian artifacts or the Palladian compositions of this house, which you've got a Roman porch, a Venetian window, a Diocletian window, and then all sealed with the closed pediment at the top. Now, the bays, the canted bays to the left and the right of the central composition are perhaps not that Palladian. They're probably much more English than they were Italian, but nevertheless, this house is a very grand, high status house within the town. And next door, this is the former coach house that came with that house. It was used as a coach house right up until the early part of the 20th century, then converted in around 1927 into two dwellings now. And then directly across the street, you have Dr. Taylor's house. Barry mentioned Dr. Taylor earlier on, and he was the self-styled king of Ashbourne. And it's believed originally that this house might have been built before the Grey House. I think Arthur Oswald in Country Life, who was one of the first people to generate some interest in thinking about the architecture of these two buildings being by the same architect. He thought that the Mansion House had been built before the Grey House, but it's more likely that the Mansion House was actually built after the Grey House, and probably built to almost try and keep up with his neighbour. If you imagine Dr. Taylor was considered a gentleman, the tradesman across the road had a very nice house built, or a facade built on his house. And I think Dr. Taylor was probably a little bit envious and attempted to, in some way, to outdo his neighbour. Now, this house is much more Palladian. It has the same central composition, and it's much more Palladian in its style. But it probably doesn't shine as much these days from the fact that it's made out of brick rather than ashlar stone, which is what the Grey House is made from. Again, the circumstantial evidence around whether Pickford was the designer and the builder of this building is quite limited. We have no historical record that proves beyond doubt that Pickford was the designer. But if you look at the top of the central composition, the open pediment, you can see that on Pickford's own house on Friargate, it has exactly the same open pediment with rubbed brick facades that is almost identical to the one on Dr. Taylor's house. And I think it stands to say that no architect would have copied that level of motif or device from another architect, that it has to be the same architect that designed both of those houses. As Barry was saying, Dr. Taylor and Dr. Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson, were good school friends, and Dr. Johnson visited this house sometimes on an annual basis, but in most cases every couple of years, from the period from around from the late 1740s right up until the early 1780s. And here's the great man himself. So a picture on the left, which is Dr. Johnson, painted by Joshua Reynolds in 1772, and then his well-known companion, James Boswell, on the right, painted by George Willison in 1765. Boswell would have been about 25 years old at this stage, and it's probably not long after when he started frequently coming to Ashbourne on accompanying Samuel Johnson. The rear of the mansion house is actually very different to the remodeled facade, but it actually gives you a very indication of what the front of the house would have looked like before the Pickford remodel. So very similar in some sense to the grammar school I showed you earlier. So a H plan with two large street-facing gables, such as this. And you can also see in the center, just beyond this tree, you can see the famous octagonal room or music room that Dr. Taylor used to do pretty much all his entertaining in for his entrance to his garden. And as Barry said, his garden was an attempt at some way to create his own picturesque garden, and housed some really nice architecture in itself. So this Roman Doric summer house, which is just inside the mansion garden, is a Grade 2 star building in its own right. Moving just down the road and around the corner, this is the third of the so-called Pickford villas. Now, as you can clearly see, the Lloyds Bank. This house was built for a local lawyer called Francis Beresford, who was a very successful businessman as well as a lawyer. He was reportedly a co-founder of the Butterley Company, the great iron company that took on lots of the ironwork in the late 18th and early 19th century. And this house was built, we think, around 1768. Certainly the building plot was bought around 1675, and a house of this size, the two wings either side of it would have been added much later, but the central house would have probably taken a year or maybe two to build. But a very grand house in ashlar stone, but in some way, very similar to a house that we know that Pickford designed, which is, I think, out of the three villas, we can say with some certainty that Pickford definitely designed and probably built this house, due to the fact that he almost copied the same design a couple of years later for number 44 Friargate in Derby. And you can see from, even though this building is faced with brick and the other building was faced with stone, you can clearly see the similarities, the Venetian windows, the open pedimented door case, the blind arches. There's a slight difference in the cornice, but other than that, it's an almost identical design. So I think it's clear evidence that Pickford would have been involved in at least the design of Compton House. And here's a comparison of the door cases. I think the door case on the left is Compton House, the door case on the right is number 44 Friargate, but certainly the door on the left, for my taste, has these lovely vermiculated pilasters that you can see just either side of the door. They are really, really nice things. And then again, moving onward, we roughly about 1768, I've put this in, this is one of the almshouses in Ashbourne. Ashbourne has many almshouses, but this is what I would describe as the atypical variant of all the almshouses. This was designed by William Harrison of Derby and built around 1768. And as the Ashbourne Local History Group will tell you, this is perhaps the most known building in terms of its construction process for inventory. We know how many people worked on this building, we know what they were paid, we know where the materials came from. This building provided a really good example of how an 18th century building would have been constructed. And then moving away from architecture slightly, Barry mentioned the figure of Brook Boothie, or should I say Sir Brook Boothie, who was here painted by Joseph Wright of Derby in 1781. Now, this gentleman occupied Ashbourne Hall and was, as Barry said, was responsible for redesigning the park that still pretty much exists today. And this gentleman was famous for lots of things, but one of the things that he was most famous for was being the acquaintance or friend of the Swiss-French radical Enlightenment philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau was in England or exiled in England in the early 1770s, and Brook Boothie became a good friend of his. Now, this painting was painted to document something that happened roughly just before Rousseau's death in 1778, I think, which he Buck Boothby went to Paris to take the manuscript from a book we now know as the Dialogues, and he brought it back to England, and a few years later published it. It was the first publication of that Rousseau book. He published it in Lichfield with his own money in 1780. And then he commissioned Joseph Wright of Derby to document that process. I think what's interesting is he seems to be clutching the manuscript that I'm talking about. But as Barry said earlier, the background for this image is most likely based on an idealized form of what was the Ashbourne Hall Park. Just going back to Buck Boothby, I'd probably say that at this point, the 1780s was probably the high point in the sort of fashionable society of Ashbourne at the time. After 1780, if you think about 1780 as a date, only 4 years later, Samuel Johnson passed away. Only 8 years later, Dr. Taylor himself passed away. So the general cultural group that existed, or the fashionable group that existed in Ashbourne at this time, started to sort of go through a little bit of demise. It didn't go off a cliff, but its light started to dim a little. And if you think about this period, that Buxton, a town very near here, John Carr had already started work on the Great Crescent in Buxton at this time. So there was probably a shift from Ashbourne to Buxton in terms of the fashionable society dwelling there. But despite that, buildings were still going up, very grand pieces of what Barry would call late quintessential Georgian architecture. And this is a good example of that. So the Ivies, this is the house where Barry was indicating that the arbour was in the back garden. And this is number 49. And again, you can date this by some of the characteristics of the building. It's both flat physically and metaphorically. It's a very good example of late Georgian architecture, but very minimal. And then moving back up the street and slightly later, we have Hamilton House. So this is a Regency house, unfortunately a little bit worse for wear at the moment, but a good example of Regency architecture. You can see the very thin glazing bars in the window on the left-hand side. And we know that from certain historical records that the pediments for this building on the second story and on the first story, they were added much later. So they were added about 1900. But the balcony existed pretty much from when the building was erected. And then moving again just down the street a little bit further, we've already seen the house on the left, but this house on the right is a sort of Regency building of roughly about 1820. Possibly could be a little bit later, probably about 1830. But if we take the date that we think that the Vine House was constructed, which is around 1730, 1740, there's at least about 100 years between these two houses. They are two of the grandest houses on this part of the street, and they stand with much grace.
Well, we come here to yet another of these great characters associated with Ashbourne, and in this case, the great physician, poet, and philosopher Erasmus Darwin, who was grandfather of the even greater Charles Darwin. Madge House here at the far eastern end of St. John Street was the house which he purchased the property. He was a man who, he married twice, but between wives, he had a relationship with his son's governess, Mary Parker. She presented him with two daughters, Susanna in 1772 and Mary 2 years later. He treated them splendidly as equals with his own 14 legitimate children. And in 1794, he bought the property here, which was actually the old Nag's Head Inn, more or less at the gates of Ashbourne Hall. And here, his daughters set up a boarding school for girls. 3 years later, he published this plan for the conduct of female education in boarding schools. A multi-chaptered publication, a proper book, but in fact, it's pretty much explicitly a promotional advertisement for the school which his daughters were running. It even included charges for admission. Amusingly, despite the inclusion of a chapter on chastity, it drew on revolutionary ideas of his friend Jean-Jacques Rousseau also. At some time, perhaps a little before 1830, because it is actually on that 1830 map, or at least there is a building on the 1830 map which has this slightly advanced front. You can see how it advances from the building next door. So it does suggest that this front was built by the time that map was drawn up in 1830. So this is a new facade onto the old inn. The inn was very capacious because they could accommodate 30 girl boarders. But this new facade is very much a transitional building. The architecture is transitional from late Georgian to early Victorian. And so that's a rather neat way to bring to an end our gallop through Georgian Ashbourne.
Mm-hmm. And just to end, this building isn't in Ashbourne. It's actually about 10 miles north in the market town of Wirksworth, situated behind St Mary's Church. But it indicates that the actual change that was taking place at the time. So you can see that this building has some symmetrical elements or some classical form, but you can actually see the devices that are expressing its mood are actually moving towards the Gothic. And I think this building, I often refer to this building as Wirksworth's very own Strawberry Hill. This building was starting to show that the Gothic was actually moving towards what we now consider to be the Gothic revival, but this building indicates that. There's very few Gothic buildings in Ashbourne, but this building, I think, sort of indicates that there was a change in the style, and the style was simply moving over towards Gothic, and classicism, or European classicism as we know it, as we've seen it in Ashbourne, was unfortunately falling out of favour. Thank you for joining us.
We can now deal with some questions.
Thank you so much, Barry and Mark. I've just had one question on the chat. Maybe this is one for you, Barry, from Carolyn, who asks, are the exteriors and interiors restricted from any changes?
Well, I think, I haven't checked, but I imagine every single building we have been looking at this afternoon is listed, and therefore any alteration, any material alteration to its appearance or character would be subject to listed building controls. Doesn't mean that you can't do anything, but it does mean you would have to apply to the local planning authority for permission to do anything. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I think so.
Could I suggest that anyone who has any questions puts them in the chat box at the side? If you don't know how to do that, then look at the bottom of your screen and there's a little bubble with chat against it. Click on that, and you should end up with a little white box on the right hand side, and you can type in there. You just at the bottom there's a thing that says to everyone. You can type your question there, and then you just press your return button and it'll pop up and everyone can see the question, and then we can direct that to one of our guides. So we'll just wait and see if there are any more questions. While we're waiting to see other questions come forward, I'd just like to say that you might have noticed this is free. We've not charged for this virtual tour, but we would welcome your donations, whether large or small donations, to help us with the cost of our work. And that work is not only just rescuing and restoring historic buildings at risk, but also informing historic building owners and others about the value of their and our built heritage. So there's a lot to do there. And if you're not already a friend of the Trust, then please do consider becoming a friend and joining and supporting us. Or you can simply just follow us on the newsletter and see what we're doing. But it would be wonderful if you'd be friends. And I'm going to ask Lucy if she could pop on the screen at some stage before the hour is out, how people could join and how they could donate. I think that will be helpful.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions that have come in. Is the Heritage Centre still in Ashbourne? Someone's asking here.
The building is still in Ashbourne, where the Heritage Centre was based, but I don't believe that the Ashbourne Heritage Centre is based in that building anymore.
Okay, Barry and Mark, which building is your favourite in Ashbourne?
Wow.
Well, shall I go first?
You can't take mine.
I think my favourite has to be the mansion, simply because the most amazing social history that it embodies, with the amazing Dr. Taylor and Dr. Johnson and Boswell, all those wonderful stories. Although I'm also rather fond of the house next door to it, the one nearer the church, which is called the Old House, because in my professional role, as I said, I had the privilege of being able to have entree to a lot of buildings that aren't open to the public. I did have the most amazing afternoon at the Old House when Miss Hollick was the owner. She was a maiden lady, the daughter of the general practitioner, the doctor of Ashbourne, Dr. Hollick, who was a kind of quasi-squire in his day, I think, a bit like Dr. Taylor. And Miss Hollick kept the Old House in the most immaculate way. You entered and you saw yards and yards of beautifully beeswaxed oak floorboards going right through the hall to the back door, which led out into this most beautiful garden. And she was a botanist, and her whole garden was a botanic garden. She was extraordinarily well informed about botany. And I was joined by Miss Joan Sinar, the county archivist, on this visit. And we sat on a pleasant spring afternoon outside and sipping homemade lemonade, which Miss Hollick brought up from the beautiful and immaculate vaulted cellars of the house, looking out over this garden. And it was just a special moment, which was spoilt only by the distressing story Miss Hollick then told of how a few days earlier at Shrovetide, as she described, a band of yahoos climbed over the garden wall and trampled through her beautiful botanic garden. And goodness, I could understand how distressed she was. But it was such a wonderful party, not a party, but a wonderful just vignette of life in Ashbourne in the 1970s. Over to you, Mark.
Well, I think as you've obviously taken the role of gentleman in the gentleman's house, the mansion, I'll have to take the role of tradesman. And I think my favourite house would certainly be the Grey House, which is we would be facing or facing neighbours, as it were. So I think the Grey House would definitely be my favourite.
Thank you. We're getting lots of questions now. Did Charles Darwin himself come to Ashbourne? Do you know?
I'm afraid I don't. No.
I don't believe so. I've not seen anything that suggests he did. There are probably other people on the call that could probably answer that better. I know Adrian Hemstock is with us, but I think, as far as I know, no.
Okay. Are there descendants of Brooke Boothby around now?
Not to my knowledge. Again, do you know, Mark?
Not that I would imagine there is, but not in the aristocratic sense. Obviously, he was the sixth baronet, so I'm sure that they
eventually sold the mansion. They sold the hall, and I think the association with the town more or less ended then. Actually, the end of Brooke Boothby's life was very, very sad. Tragically, he and his wife had one child, Penelope, who died as a child. And in the church is the most beautiful marble tomb with the sleeping Penelope Boothby, a sculpture of her lying on the tomb. It's extraordinarily touching. And doing the research for this book, I discovered the maquette for that tomb is in the Sir John Soane Museum at Lincoln's Inn, London. But the death of the child probably led to the breakup of the marriage and eventually serious financial problems. Brooke Boothby had to move and live abroad for financial reasons and died abroad.
Mark, can you just repeat the date of the Gothic Revival house in Wirksworth, please?
Oh, sorry, repeat. It was built by a local stonemason called William Masgrave, and we think it was built around 1828. But
it's not a house, it's a replacement of the Elizabethan grammar school.
Yes.
It is now split into two houses.
Yeah, two dwellings.
Two dwellings.
Yeah.
Okay. Any insight into trying to protect buildings in Ashbourne from traffic-induced seismic shock?
That's a thorny question. A bypass is the answer.
Yeah. It's not above our pay grade, but beyond our political status, I think, to suggest what the might be.
Any information on how many residential buildings are still in residential use in Ashbourne? Someone has actually replied to this on the chat saying many still are, although several have been divided into apartments. I'm guessing that's your...
I think there's actually, certainly from the time I've lived locally, I think there's actually a lot of houses coming back into residential ownership. And I think given our current circumstances, we may see more of that in the future. But certainly some of the houses that were, dare I say, a little bit more run down, and certainly when I first moved here, have now been given a new lease of life by new owners. So I think that it seems to me that certainly the Georgian houses are starting to attract people back as residential rather than as retail or commercial buildings.
How does Ashbourne fit into the overall picture of Georgian Derbyshire in terms of importance and relative population size?
Ooh, top of the tree, I would say, Barry.
Yes, I would agree. I think it is the Georgian town par excellence in Derbyshire.
I think
there are bits of Derby that vie with it, of course, and bits of Chesterfield, bits of Buxton, but it's such a wonderful ensemble. You know, the walk we've done down Church Street and St. John Street is unmatched, really, anywhere else.
And not necessarily just in Derbyshire. I think if you think of a sort of intact Georgian town of this type, I can think of ones in the South Midlands in places like Pershore and Bewdley, but you know, very few towns, market towns, come close to Ashbourne for it being an intact Georgian town. I often make the point that Ashbourne remained a Georgian town. It didn't become a 19th century town. It didn't become a 20th century town. It's almost frozen in time, and that makes it very special, I think.
Getting some interesting information in the chat from Peter is saying in 1801 the population was around 2,000. And there's a publication called The Ghost in the Garden, which describes how Erasmus Darwin brought the building which his daughters turned into the girls' school, and very sure edited that. Yeah. Someone asks, are we planning to do a physical tour in Ashbourne when we can?
I guess if there's an audience for it, and given our current circumstances, that might be difficult in terms of managing group numbers. But I think come the summer, when hopefully things are slightly more normal than they are currently, then I would certainly like to do a walking tour. I'm sure Barry would also be in favour of that. So if people think that they would like to come to Ashbourne and they'd like to spend a couple of hours with us walking down Church Street and looking around the marketplace, I'd definitely be happy to do that. So perhaps based on people's requests in the chat, we'll decide whether there's an opportunity to do that.
Yes, as originally conceived, this was going to be a walking tour. We converted it to a Zoom presentation, which in a way had its merits, because it was nice to be able to show you those two wonderful plans, which, you know, one can sometimes wave around printed out plans, but perhaps this is easier to see. But anyway, yes, we hope to be able to take a physical tour up and down Church Street and St. John Street. But we do limit those tours to 20, and we do give preference to members, priority to members of the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust. They get priority chance for booking.
Thank you, Barry. And just, well, we're getting a lot of interest in that, so hopefully that's one to watch. As Derek mentioned, if you do want to donate or find out more about the Trust, the best place to go to is our website, and the address is actually on the screen there for people to follow. Our next visit is actually, we are planning that to be a physical tour, but we're keeping a close eye on that, and that will be to Sudbury Parish on the 18th of April at 2 o'clock. So further details will come out about that nearer to the time when we know we can definitely do it, but we are planning on doing that as a physical tour. Okay, so I think it's just a lot of thanks for your time, Mark and Barry, that's coming through. I think people thoroughly enjoyed it. So,
yeah, hope so.
Yes, if I could just say thank you everybody for coming. We've had 140 odd people with us at one point during it, which would have been very difficult to handle on site and take a tour around. So I think what we're going to look to do, we're not quite sure how we're going to do this in the future, is that when we do our tours, which will be limited to 20, we're also going to do try and do something virtual as well. And I've noted that some people have been watching from Lincoln and Edinburgh and London. And obviously it's so difficult for them to pop for a 2-hour tour, but this way they do get to see our wonderful Georgian town. So when we're doing our future tours and talks, we'll see if we can combine in some way, which we've yet to discover and yet to work out exactly how we can reach you all. So thank you everyone for participating today, and for your lots of interesting questions, and very much for all the wonderful comments that you're making now about the talk and about your desire to join us on the tour. We'll see what we can do for that. Of course, there's lots of different towns in Derbyshire and different places, and we will be doing tours of as many as we can. At the moment we're planning for one a month. But if we can get more support and more help from people, well, I'm sure we can increase that number. And we just would like you to join us and help us in what we do, wherever you are. So thank you very much. I'm going to say goodbye and to wave you off. And I'm going to go for Barry and Mark and say thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek.
Been a pleasure. And I see we have people watching from Chicago, Devon and Lincoln, amongst other places.
Wow. Chicago town.
And Kendal.
Do you want me to stop sharing screen now, Lucy? Is that?
yes, I'm going to end the meeting now. Thank you, Mark.
That's right.
No, I'll have a cup of tea.